Now on Eve, as I mentioned, he created a full-sized Eve for this flanking the gates, but he never finished it. One of the reasons why he never finished it was, even though he had the same girlfriend, let's say, it's not exactly the right companion maybe, for 52 or 54 years, he married her. It was like 2 weeks before she died, and that was only 6 months before he died. He did churn through affairs a lot during his lifetime. He was short and a little stocky, kind of a tough guy with, as he described it, very short, stubby fingers. But he was extremely popular with the ladies. And so he was a very sensual person, of course, and he loved all his models, figuratively and literally. And with Eve, what's interesting about Eve is he worked on it for a long time, and he would sculpt it essentially based on whoever he was currently involved with. And so he churned through quite a few women on this. What he stopped working on was her face, but continued to work on her body. Because after a few new affairs, he just couldn't keep reworking the face. So he's like, okay, we'll stop on the face. The face has this kind of interesting fawn-like look to it, which you can kind of see. I mean, you can walk up in there. Normally this would be here for guests, but you can kind of see what's going on here, I think. But the face isn't really completed very much. You can kind of see, it's almost like one half. This half is a little bit better, but this half is not quite so good. And when she's looking straight on, when you look at her straight on, she looks fawn-like a little bit, like some kind of mythic figure. So the last model he had for this, which we can see from slightly here, was 3 months pregnant at the time. And that's what we're seeing there on her. She's a little pudgy right there from that. But you can see that the figure, that he's using here, this is not some idealized, goddess-like body. I mean, here's a woman with kind of a strong thighs, very, very sort of grounded and earthy. It's not this kind of elegant, kind of, extended figure that was idealized at the time in classical figures. But what's most fascinating about this, and exactly what Rodin wanted to do, was that it was the shadow that told the story. And so here was a woman scorned, cast out of the garden, right? I mean, there's, because she's bad and all this other kind of, drudgery kind of stuff going on. She's sort of, hiding her face. When I first saw this, I thought she was giving God the finger, but it's not. It's not her middle finger, but I thought that was kind of funny. But anyway, what's fascinating is what happens in the shadow as she transforms into this extraordinarily elegant figure, which was exactly what Rodin intended to be told, was that here was a woman cast out of the garden who was finally actually released into our world. And in the story, essentially became all of our mother at some point. So rather than look at this as this kind of damning idea of this mythic figure being cast out of the garden because she was sinful, Rodin saw this as something that actually liberated her and turned her into a real human who made a huge difference, obviously, in all of our lives, but rose up and became extraordinarily beautiful and elegant. So there's something very, very sensual, but also very kind of sexy about the shadow that he was casting from, that he was designing from, because remember, he worked from the outlines, not from the shape of the figure. So It's fascinating to see what it is that Rodin saw as he worked, and then what he created, and how that shadow was so critical to him. Because it really, I think if you saw that shadow, a photo of that shadow, and then a photo of what we're looking at right here, you wouldn't think it was the same piece. You'd say, oh, well, that looks like some amazingly sensual nymph that's kind of, extended and stretched and super elegant. Like a pinup girl, it looks like. And then you see it here and it's like, well, this looks like a real woman here. So that contrast is what's really, really amazing in how his work is transformed by the silhouette. And whether you're turning a thinker in the shadow or you're turning the kiss, the same thing happens on the shadow. The shadow is what completes and tells the story, and it's the main reason why the exhibit is called Light and Shadow, meaning that shadow, unlike darkness, they're very different things, because darkness exists without light, shadow requires light. And so it's really important, and it's one of the things that the book, which is called Casting Shadows, which is kind of a play on the idea of shadow, but also the idea of cast sculpture, plays on that idea, particularly for young people, is that a shadow is not an evil thing. A shadow is a companion of light, and it would not exist without light. So that there needs to be that understanding that the difference between darkness and shadow. And so that's really, really the focus of what it is we're talking about with this exhibit, and it's one of the things that was real important with Rodin in his entire work, because he felt that it was in the shadows of his work that you understood the real story of his work.